Hello and welcome to my BrewEd presentation on teacher agency. My name is Kevin Smith. I'm a senior lecturer in education in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. I've been at Cardiff now for 8 years, 5 years lecturing in the school and 3 years before that working at the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, which is a mouthful. So we just call it Wizard. Prior to my time at Wizard, I was the fellow in curriculum at the Institute of Education with the University of the South Pacific. And prior to my experiences in the Pacific, I was a secondary school teacher for 6 years in Cincinnati, Ohio. And in fact, it was my experiences as a teacher in Ohio that I think have had the most profound impact on my journey in higher education so far, and specifically with my research interests, which focus on curriculum theory, curriculum theorizing, and critical and radical approaches to education. And by radical, I mean simply identifying and trying to get to the roots of educational issues and problems, set against the broader aim of social transformation. And by social transformation, I think I'm really talking about thinking purposefully and carefully about how to create a socially just and inclusive society and what relationship education has in achieving those aims. Of course, there's the obligatory Twitter handle, so if you like to participate in that special kind of hell that we call EduTwitter, feel free to give me a shout and I'll follow you back. And of course, lastly, I have a blog where every post is my attempt to meaningfully talk about an educational topic or issue in 800 words or less. And it's a fun little exercise for me, but I also hope it serves as providing an entertaining, quick read for people and will provide them with conversation starters and points of reflection that hopefully will inform their practice. So without further ado, let's talk about agency. Teacher agency has been theorized for a couple of decades now, but it is still a rather under-theorized aspect of educational research. Emerbeyer and Misch in 1998 developed what they called the chordal triad in their approach to theorizing agency, and they argued it was comprised of iterative, projective, and practical evaluative dimensions. Or in other words, it's a configuration of influences from the past, orientations towards the future, and an engagement with the present. And these ideas influenced others and spurred them on to think about agency in different ways. And one of those ways is an approach called ecological agency. And ecological agency is a way of thinking about agency in terms of something that is acquired within an ecological setting. And so it's not necessarily inherent within individuals, nor is it inherent entirely in the setting. It is something that is achieved. And so Priestley et al. In 2015 discussed ecological agency as a methodological and theoretical framework for an empirical inquiry on teacher agency. And what I find compelling and really interesting about this approach is that, again, it situates agency not as an individual capacity, but as something that's achieved. And it's achieved in and through concrete contexts for action. And so that's the theoretical position. That's the framework I'm using in terms of designing the research and interpreting the data. So let's talk about the actual research itself. So I approached 856 schools to recruit a sample. All of the activities that I undertook for this study were informed by the British Educational Research Association's Ethical Guidelines, which is a fantastic document that you can get from the Bureau website. In terms of my approach, there was a two-stage approach to gathering data. One was a quantitative online survey, and the second was semi-structured interviews with the participants, some of the participants who completed that survey. Now, admittedly, an online survey is not the best way to go about trying to understand agency. It's a rather blunt instrument for what can be a very sophisticated and nuanced topic. But there's a method to the madness. So the idea I had hoped that I would have a few hundred teachers in terms of the sample, and then I could ask them general questions and then do an initial analysis of those results that would help inform the kinds of questions that I would ask teachers more specifically and at a granular level in our semi-structured interviews. So the kind of questions that were included in the survey were: how important is teacher agency to you? Are you satisfied with your levels of teacher agency? And other questions like that. I'm only going to talk about 3 of those questions here in this presentation, and 2 other kind of open-ended questions where we asked teachers what factors of their educational context did they believe increased their agency and what factors of the educational context do they believe limited their agency. So we have some qualitative data that will help us give us some inkling of the detailed understandings of agency. But those big broad ideas, how important it is to you, I was going to take the data from those and then create questions for the semi-structured interviews. That might be something like, for instance, if they were talking about achievement, for instance, and you could say, can you tell me about a time when you felt like you were able to achieve something that you had longed, hoped to achieve? Or can you tell me about a time when you felt you were being particularly innovative and what conditions led to you feeling that way? Or can you tell me about a time when you were frustrated or felt restrained by certain conditions in the school that kept you from achieving? Those kinds of questions, I think, get more to the heart of what helps people achieve agency within their setting. So maybe we'll be able to ask those in a different project. Now, let's talk about some challenges. Some challenges, the first one I'm going to talk about, and I even hate to say it, but of course, it's COVID. At the time that I had put the survey online, I had gathered some responses, I had done some initial analysis, I was preparing to put my interview schedules together, and we shifted from our regular form of teaching to emergency teaching. And when that happened, all research went on hold, and for me anyway. And so now that some time has passed and I'm coming back to the research, I was thinking, shall we pick up the interviews? But of course, COVID is on the minds of everyone right now. And if I had these interviews, COVID would be part of that discussion, but it wasn't part of the online data. And I didn't want to introduce that kind of variability to the data. So I've elected to just drop the interviews and I'll have to rely on the open text responses from teachers. So that was a challenge. And this other challenge is not really a challenge, but maybe something we should keep in mind. And that in Wales, we have 4 regional consortia that are charged with school improvement, and they have links and relationships to schools. And one of those regional consortia has a disproportionate representation in the data. So there's more teachers from that consortium than the others. And there's a chance that that could flavor the data in a particular way. There's a chance it may not. But it's something that we should keep in mind as we're discussing these, is that that metropolitan area had a very large representation of teachers in it. And then finally, the greatest challenge I think we face in Wales in terms of educational research is that we as a nation have struggled to develop a sustainable capacity and culture for high quality education in Wales. And there's different reasons for that. And that's not to say we don't have excellent researchers here. We do. We have, of course, Wizard and other institutes that are making great contributions to education. And we also have fantastic individuals from our HEIs across Wales who are doing excellent research here, but we need more. And also we need to have a closer and more collaborative relationship with our schools. And I believe part of this comes from 2 main problems. One problem is the constant and regular policy upheaval that has plagued the educational sector here in Wales for decades. I think the tumult and the upheaval and the constant stop-start and pivots to new directions has placed schools on the back foot. I also believe that there's a overly punitive accountability regime in Wales that, when considered in conjunction with all this upheaval, has placed many schools into survival mode. They focus on surviving, not flourishing. And when that happens, they don't have the time, the energy, the resources to engage in the kinds of activities that actually will bring about the results they hope to achieve in terms of pupil outcomes, community outreach, pedagogical practice, etc. And so until we solve these issues, we will constantly be plagued by this inability to create a sustainable, high-quality research environment here. So my plea to everyone listening to this and watching this right now is to help us in achieving that aim of a really rich, high-capacity, high-quality research environment. All right, now let's look at the data, the sample. The sample, 131 participants. They were primarily female, 61.3% female, largely of European heritage, 96.9% there. 71.8% were from secondary schools, 28.2% from primary schools. In terms of roles of the teachers, that 25.2% represents teachers with teaching responsibilities. 45% teacher plus means teachers with teaching responsibilities plus some leadership responsibilities like head of department or curriculum lead. And then 29.8% senior management team members. And of the 131 participants, 29 had identified themselves as head teachers, which suggests that 29 schools took part. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the distribution of teaching experience amongst the participants. And I'd asked the respondents if they were members of the Pioneer School Program or not. The Pioneer School Program was part of the rollout of the curriculum framework and the development of the curriculum framework for Wales. And it had 3 areas: digital literacy, professional learning, and curriculum development. Now, in the curriculum development group, they were comprised of individuals working in groups that were associated with the 6 areas of learning and experience that are part of the curriculum framework. And you can see those as expressive arts, humanities, languages, etc. So this 19.1% is comprised of these groups down here. Now, there's one more group, health and well-being, and it just so happened that I didn't have any health and well-being folk respond, and that was just how the data played out. So that's the description of the sample. Let's look at the data. And like I said, I'm only going to focus on a couple of questions. The first question, and again, it was a rather general question: how important is teacher agency to you? Do teachers in Wales consider agency to be important to them? 87.1% said, yes, we think it's important. So then I asked, well, how satisfied are you with your current level or sense of teacher agency? And we had some slightly different responses. 64.1% said they were satisfied, and 9.9% said they were unsatisfied. And so then I thought, well, let's try and tease this out a little bit more. We have to make comparisons between different groups and different variables to see if we can identify statistically significant differences. And lo and behold, I found one. And it seems that primary teachers are far more likely to say they're satisfied with their levels of agency than their secondary counterparts. And in fact, secondary teachers are twice as likely to say they're unsatisfied with their levels of agency compared to their primary school colleagues. So there's something there that we need to understand. There's some factors contributing to these statistically recognized differences, these significant differences. And as we go through the next couple of things of data, maybe some things will pop up and we might be able to look at some potential reasons why. The second set of questions I want to look at is the idea of the importance of agency in regard to various dimensions of teaching. And so I asked on the survey, how important is teacher agency to you in regard to choosing curriculum content, selecting instructional methods, approaches to behavioral management, engaging in action research, and undertaking professional development? And so the green responses are we think it's important, the blue is neither important nor unimportant, and the red is it's unimportant. And so the number one, which was not a surprise to me, but teachers felt like teacher agency was most important in consideration of selecting instructional methods. And that was followed by choosing curriculum content at 79.4%, and then professional development and action research. But there's quite a difference here between, 11 percentage points between instructional methods and curriculum content. So instructional methods are clearly the leader here. The big surprise to me, of course, was that just over half of the respondents felt that teacher agency was important in terms of approaches to behavioral management. And in fact, when you look at the amount of respondents who said it was unimportant, over 1/4 of the respondents said that teacher agency was not important when it comes to approaches to behavioral management. So folks, if you're watching this, I would love to hear your views on these couple of points here. First, on the importance of agency. What do you think about that? Is that what you would expect? Why or why not? And then responses about the satisfaction of agency. What can you tell me about 64.1 people being satisfied and roughly 10% being unsatisfied? And then, of course, these disparities between secondary and primary teachers. And then, of course, tell me about this. I want to know your thoughts about, is teacher agency important when it comes to approaches to managing pupils' behavior? Now let's talk about the open-ended, the qualitative stuff that we gathered through the survey. And this is still a work in progress. We haven't completed the qualitative analysis of this yet. So I'm doing kind of a rough approach here for you now. I'm just going to talk about themes and ideas that came through the data that I recognized in the data that I felt had import or some kind of significance about them. Trust senior management, let me tell you the numbers here. The numbers here tell us about the responses to these questions. So 20 senior management team members responded and 16 teachers responded for factors from their educational context that they believe increase their teacher agency. The first thing I want to talk about from the senior management folks are trust. They were talking about enabling staff to take risks and be creative and having the trust to enable them to do so. So these are actually some samples from the responses you can read here. So they talked about having trust in their teachers as professionals, which I think is an important word to continue to include when we talk about teachers as professionals, because the professionalism of teachers, I believe, is being eroded ever since probably the early 80s and particularly into the 90s. And we need to reclaim the professionalization of teachers and reconstruct it in very positive ways. The possibly the most significant theme that came, though, was leadership. So, and that makes sense because these are senior management team members. And they talk a lot about empowerment of teachers. And some of the sub-themes that came out of this were this idea that we need to empower teachers to collaborate with each other, and that schools need to collaborate with schools in a close working relationship. So if we were to have semi-structured interviews, what I might do is take this phrase and say, okay, as part of this study, someone said that the ability to move forward as a school comes from strong and quality leadership. As a member of a senior management team, what do you think is strong and quality leadership? And then we would start picking apart those answers. Or I might ask them, how do you envision schools working closely together? What does closely mean? And how do you envision that happening? I particularly enjoyed this response about pedagogy. At my school, we've always placed a great emphasis on increasing the quality of teaching through empowering teachers to make choices about their pedagogical practice. And then it goes on to talking about making sure they're aware of current practices through professional learning and sharing that learning. And then finally, with the senior management team, the curriculum for Wales was a significant theme, and particularly when they talked about innovation and collaboration. And we're not going to see a lot of differences here with the teachers. If we shift to the teacher side of things, again, the most significant thing we find is this trust from leadership to allow teachers to innovate. And I think that's related also to recognizing and acknowledging and honoring teachers' professionalism and subject expertise. Not only subject expertise, but pedagogical expertise as well. So they talk about the flexibility to write their own program of study, a lack of meddling by senior management, having professional confidence in their decisions, feeling free and having encouragement. Those kinds of things are very powerful, I think, kind of responses that these teachers have provided. And again, the school ethos and culture very closely related to leadership, having support for action inquiry and a culture for learning. Engagement with educational research is part of that. And again, collaboration with colleagues. Now let's look at what these folks felt were factors from their educational context that limit their teacher agency. So we look at the senior management responses, we can see that the largest theme or the most significant theme was an accountability culture. And in fact, not that frequency says a whole lot, but of the 20 responses, 11 of the 20 responses included the phrase high stakes accountability. That is significant. They talk about an overprescription of assessment outcomes, high levels of narrowly focused accountability, external performance measures, an emphasis on meeting outcomes and providing data for government needs that has placed too much pressure on teachers to give up on what is good teaching, tick box exercises, and closed thinking. And they also talk about some of the middle tier organizations like Eston and suggesting that there are poor models of inspection, analysis, and evaluation, overly punitive accountability approaches enforced by regional consortia in Eston, and Eston and Alaska schools not prepared to be brave and independent. And they're saying that teacher capacity will only improve when these mindsets change. So that's kind of a very strong and forceful response there. And then they also talk about time. The time to think and act is very limited. And they point that to budgets and, again, this accountability regime. Schools are held to account in so many ways it's detrimental to teacher agency. Now, if we shift to the right here and look at the teachers' responses, they talk about the same thing, an accountability culture. Assessment drives to report data to leadership for the sake of data, and to key stage levels and being judged on the outcome of those grades. Exam specifications, Head teachers being worried about external accountability measures, all of these being perceived as limits to their teacher agency. And then finally, the current national curriculum. And again, this is related to an accountability culture, but it's also a time issue. And it's also about the freedom to make curriculum choices. If you are presented with, this is what I want to teach within my subject area, but I'm under so much pressure to only address the things that are on the assessments, then we've reduced ourselves to a teaching to the test kind of climate and culture, and that they are recognizing as a limit to their agency. So, in summary, of the 131 teachers surveyed, a vast majority felt teacher agency was an important concept to them. 64% felt that they were satisfied. But there was a big disparity between the satisfaction of secondary school teachers with agency compared to primary school teachers. Agency was deemed to be most important in regard to selecting instructional methods, closely followed by curriculum, but it was deemed unimportant when it came to approaches to behavioral management of pupils' behavior. In terms of increasing agency, trust from senior management, proactive leadership in supporting collaboration and pedagogical development, innovation and collaboration for the new curriculum framework, and professional development that includes engaging with educational research. In terms of limits to agency, overwhelmingly so far from the data, an accountability culture that is punitive and reductive, and a national curriculum that places too many limitations on curriculum choice and time. And then finally, a lack of time for collaboration, development, and innovation. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I tried to keep it under 20 minutes and didn't quite make it, so I apologize for that. I'd like to thank BrewEd for inviting me, and thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or find my profile page at the university's website and send me an email. I'd be happy to have conversations with anyone. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great day.